Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Wednesday, January 18th. I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan. We begin the newscast tonight with a major announcement today that Canada has committed 200 more armoured vehicles to Ukraine to help with the country's defence. Defence Minister Anita Anand made the announcement during a surprise trip to the country to meet with her Ukrainian counterpart, Alexei Reznikov. In addition to the $5 billion that Canada has provided in military, financial, and humanitarian assistance since last February, Canadian soldiers are also training Ukrainian forces in the United Kingdom and Poland. The federal New Democrats kicked off a 3-day caucus retreat in Ottawa today with a keynote address from Jagmeet Singh. The NDP leader's speech focused heavily on the struggles faced by the working class. Mr. Singh accuses Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal government of waging war against workers. He also accuses Mr. Trudeau of allowing some Canadian premiers to dismantle Medicare by introducing publicly funded but privately delivered healthcare services. While on the topic of healthcare, Nova Scotia has announced changes aimed at treating emergency room patients more quickly. Health Minister Michelle Thompson says the recent deaths of 2 women who waited hours for care have added a sense of urgency for action. The changes include creating doctor-led triage teams that will focus on admitting patients more quickly into emergency departments and assigning extra physician assistants and nurse practitioners to emergency rooms. The Quebec Court of Appeal says a breathing tube can be removed from a child despite his parents' protest. The 5-year-old has been in a coma in a Montreal hospital since last June. Quebec's High Court decision agrees with a Superior Court ruling that permitted the Saint-Justine Hospital to go ahead with the procedure. The hospital went to court after the boy's parents refused to consent to the procedure unless the hospital was willing to restore the tube should things go wrong. The child was hospitalized after falling into the family swimming pool, with court evidence showing he suffered serious and irreversible brain damage. A First Nation in Northern Ontario says it has uncovered close to 200 plausible burial sites at a former residential school. The Wajashko Nigam Nation says its archaeological and ground-penetrating radar team detected up to 171 anomalies in the cemetery grounds at the St. Mary's residential school site in Kenora. Most of the spots are unmarked, with the exception of 5 that have grave markers, and teams will continue looking for further sites. More than 6,000 Indigenous children attended the Catholic-run institution between 1897 and 1972. Moving to the prairies now, where Saskatoon's Chamber of Commerce has asked the Competition Bureau to investigate an Air Canada decision to stop flights in Saskatchewan. The business group says the airline's decision leaves WestJet as the only airline to offer direct service between Calgary and Saskatchewan. It accuses the 2 airlines of engaging in anti-competitive behavior by reducing competition intensity over certain regional routes. Air Canada and WestJet have both rejected the allegations, saying they continue to serve Saskatchewan. On the East Coast, Community Food Centres Canada says it stands by Newfoundland-based food charities' calls for better social supports. Food First NL says it will shut down its community food helpline in March because of a lack of funding and overwhelming demand. CEO Josh Schmee says the answer is not to fund the helpline, but to boost people's incomes through increases to welfare and the minimum wage so they can afford to buy groceries. Nick Saul with Community Food Centres Canada agrees with Mr. Schmee's approval. He says food charity is not the solution to Canada's growing hunger crisis. The Women's National Basketball Association is coming to Toronto in the spring for at least 1 game. The Minnesota Lynx, whose roster features Canadians Bridget Carleton and Natalie Achonwa, will play the Chicago Sky at Scotiabank Arena in a preseason matchup on May 13th. It will be the first WNBA game ever played in Canada. Toronto marks the 3rd WNBA preseason game to be played outside the United States. Meanwhile, medals to be awarded at this summer's North American Indigenous Games in Nova Scotia will showcase Mi'kmaq art, including a traditional 8-pointed star. Indigenous athletes from across the continent will take home nearly 3,000 gold, silver, and bronze medals from the sporting competitions set for July. The design also includes a symbol that represents the word Elnu, which Mi'kmaq use to describe themselves, and features cultural drawings and etchings meant to represent what happens when people follow their dreams. The medals were designed by a student, Ella Scotthorn, from the community of Hardwoodlands, and finalized by Mi'kmaq artist Taylor Fern Paul. All right, Forum Daily will be back after the break with a look at alcohol consumption and your health. A conversation with Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of Appletree Medical Group, coming up next. After that, of course, we'll have a look at news stories from around the world. So stay tuned to Forum Daily. We will be back after a short break. Canada has adopted new guidance on low-risk alcohol consumption, drastically slashing the amount of booze considered safe in 2011. A report by the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction says the latest evidence shows that alcohol is a carcinogen associated with 7 types of cancer, mostly of the breast and colon, as well as heart and liver disease, dementia, and lower respiratory infections. Men are more likely to develop alcohol use disorders, drink excessively, be involved in vehicle crashes, and risk perpetrating violence. Joining us to discuss alcohol consumption and health is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome to Forum Daily.
Great to be here.
So firstly, what are the broad risks of overconsuming or overconsumption of alcohol?
Well, so binge drinking or drinking to excess really has a very broad list here. We've talked a little bit about unintentional injuries, violence, but heart disease, high blood pressure, inflammation of the gastrointestinal system, and also alcohol abuse disorder that can result from it. We also see many complications from acute impairment, secondarily violence there, road crashes, child abuse, and neglect. And we should mention as well that alcohol is a teratogen, which means it causes malformations of the fetus. So it can lead to learning, health and social effects, and long-term impacts when had during pregnancy as well. So quite a few effects of alcohol overuse.
And the new guidelines released this week. From your perspective as a doctor, how do you think these new the new alcohol guidance is going to affect or impact the health of Canadians, with the message, I think, effectively being less is better?
Right. So what we know during the pandemic, there were a lot of changes in alcohol consumption. In fact, 1 in 4 Canadians reported that they had increased their alcohol consumption during the pandemic. This was in fact highest in Ontario, where 30% of Ontarians increased their alcohol consumption. So the guidance is helpful because it really puts more knowledge to people about their alcohol use. And in turn, then Canadians can look at moderating their own consumption accordingly there.
Now, this report, going back to it again, the evidence shows that alcohol is a carcinogen. So what do we know about that?
Right. So in this case, what we've seen is that drinking alcohol does raise your risk of developing head and neck, breast, colorectal, esophageal, liver, stomach, and pancreatic cancers. We know that smoking and drinking together increases that risk, and it increases it far worse than if you did one or the other on its own. In terms of the actual risk, drinking about 3.5 drinks a day can double or even triple your risk of developing cancer of the mouth, pharynx, larynx, and esophagus, and can definitely increase colorectal cancer and breast cancer by about 1.5 times. So significant increases there.
Some concerning numbers there for sure. The report is also highlighting the impact of alcohol on dementia and lower respiratory infections. So can you unpack this a bit for our viewers?
Right. So respiratory infections, we're seeing data that the more you drink, the more your immune system can't fight off infections. So no surprise that we're seeing an increase in respiratory infections and even increased illnesses that we don't typically see, like tuberculosis from excessive drinking. The systematic reviews have also found that individuals who drank heavily or engaged in binge drinking were more likely to develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease rather than those who were engaged in more moderate or low alcohol consumption.
Again, also somewhat concerning information there as well. But shifting gears a bit from health to the social impacts of overconsumption, is that something that you see is as a practicing doctor? Do you deal with that sort of thing?
Right. I think we see it quite a bit. We see the increase of DUI-related accidents, traffic fatalities, public and private property damage. We also see a decline in terms of chronic health conditions, and we see the domestic violence as well as violent crime. So it certainly is very far-reaching, even from a societal point of view.
Let's not end on a negative note, but what sort of options or treatments are available, or an option for those who may suffer an addiction from alcohol or to alcohol?
Right. So if you are concerned about alcohol use, we do have a diversity of Canada-wide resources for you. Wellness Together Canada, Alcoholics Anonymous, CPHA, Moms Stop the Harm, and Families for Addiction and Recovery are some of the few ones that you could see on the Health Canada website.
Very helpful. And if you could leave our viewers with one message about alcohol consumption, what would it be?
So we're slowly coming to the main message that this guidance is saying, which is really even a small amount of alcohol is not good for your health. So the message I would leave my viewers is really the message of Cicero from 50 BC, never go to excess, but let moderation be your guide.
You can never go wrong with a quote from Cicero. Thank you for that, Dr. Raut. We look forward to having you again on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll be right back after the break, and when we return, we'll take a look at the recent pledge to send 200 armored vehicles to Ukraine. Stay with us. Questions over whether Canada and its allies would send tanks to Ukraine persist after Ottawa announced additional support to the war-torn country. During a surprise visit to Kyiv today, Defense Minister Anita Anand said Canada will send an additional 200 armored vehicles to Ukraine to help its defense against Russian attacks. Allies, including Germany, have been wrestling with whether to send tanks to Ukraine. Germany is facing pressure to not only send some of its Leopard 2 tanks, but to allow other countries that operate the same tanks to do the same. The Canadian Armed Forces has 112 Leopard 2s in use. Joining us to discuss the situation is Dr. Rob Huebert, defense expert and associate professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Huebert, welcome to Forum Daily.
Always nice to see you, Nathan.
So the defense minister recently announced Canada will donate some 200 Rochelle-made Senator armored personnel carriers to Ukraine. What is the significance of this announcement?
Well, significant in the context that the equipment itself is necessary. The of war, and we've seen this before both in Georgia and Chechnya, is to wear out the capability of its end. So in other words, it doesn't go for the overwhelming strategic victory or the flashy sort of shock and awe that Western forces often use. And so I think one of the critical things, if the Ukrainians are ultimately to persevere, they are going to have to be resupplied. So therefore, this resupplying of them is critical for any possibility of success. Significant is that we seem to see within the Canadian government at least a willingness that it has to resupply going. Of course, we'll see for certain whether or not it goes beyond what is just being announced.
And jumping off that point, allies are debating sending tanks to Ukraine. So for viewers back home, before we jump into the tank issue, so what is the difference between an armored personnel carrier and a tank?
Well, the main element in terms of the modern battle, of course, is a tank carries a much heavier armament. And so therefore it's able to hit a lot harder. It tends to have more protection. And so tanks, even though some people said that they were a thing of the past, we've seen the modern battlefield, at least the way the Russians fight wars today, is essential in terms of either being defeated if you don't have enough, or being able to sustain yourself against the Russians. And so it's the hitting power that really is at the heart here. And so therefore, some people say it's an offensive weapon system as opposed to defensive, though to be perfectly honest, I don't quite know what that means.
So I guess jumping off that point there, you say offensive system, but what is actually stopping Germany from sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine and allowing other allies to send their Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine as well?
Well, there's two factors. There's the first obvious official one that the German officials are quoting, and within German policy, there is a real heightened concern about providing weapon systems that can be seen as offensive. And this, of course, goes back to their legacy from the Second World War and their desire to be seen only as a defensive nation. So that's the first part of it. But the second part is, of course, once again, is we come back to the point: if the Russians are going to be defeated, if the are able to hold them from current gains and possibly even push them out of the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, they need to have this type of capability. And so that the fear, if the Russians understand this, if the Russians start seeing the Germans providing arms that can in fact see to their need, the question then becomes, well, what do the Russians do in response to that? And so there's a fear that such a push with the obvious ramifications that they carry for a possible Ukrainian sustainment and ultimately victory, might mean in terms of Russian reaction. And I think that's the bigger one that the Germans are really concerned about.
Lots of food for thought for sure for the Germans there. I want to jump back to an announcement last week about air defense. And again, we've only got about a minute here, so just touching on it. But the federal government's purchase of a U.S.-made air defense system has raised some questions, given that the CAF has been without a primary air defense system since about 2012. So where do things stand for air defenses here? And again, about 40 seconds.
We don't. I mean, you answered your own question, and in terms of how this seems so bizarre. Is we can appreciate that this is important for the Ukrainians and good on the government for giving it, but it illustrates the fact that our government has been so ill-disposed to actually take our own defense serious.
So that's a concerning thing. And about 10, 15 seconds here, what are you watching for next after the announcement of these 200 armored personnel carriers?
Well, if we sustain it, if we keep going, I mean, the critical thing that the Ukrainians need is a Canadian government that will keep the pipelines going along with the other NATO allies.
Lots to watch for and lots to keep monitoring as the conflict in Ukraine continues. Dr. Rob Huebert, thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Always my pleasure, Nathan.
We'll see you next time. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country is in Ukraine trying to stop a war that's been raging since 2014. Speaking at a meeting with veterans, Mr. Putin said Moscow had long sought to negotiate a settlement to the conflict in Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland of Donbas, where Russian-backed forces have been battling Ukrainian forces since 2014. NATO is warning that Russia is preparing for an extended war in Ukraine, so alliance members must be ready for the long haul. Deputy Secretary General Micha Joanna told the opening of the military chiefs meeting in Brussels that NATO will discuss how to better support Ukraine in the coming months while shoring up their own defenses. He called for greater defense investment to boost manufacturing while harnessing new technologies to prepare for future wars. All this comes as the head of the United Nations says the world is in a sorry state because of myriad interlinked challenges, including climate change and Russia's war in Ukraine. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Wednesday that the struggles are, quote, piling up like cars in a chain reaction crash. He delivered his gloomy message on the second day of the gathering of world leaders and corporate executives in Davos, Switzerland. Staying in Davos now, where U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen sat down with her Chinese counterpart in Switzerland today. It's the highest-ranking contact between the two countries since their presidents agreed to look for ways to ease strained relations. Ms. Yellen's first face-to-face meeting with Vice Premier Liu He comes as the U.S. and Chinese economies grapple with differing but intertwined challenges on trade, technology, and more. While UK inflation eased for a second month in December, boosting confidence that the country's cost of living crisis has peaked. The Office for National Statistics says consumer prices rose 10.5% in the year through December, down from 10.7% the previous month. Inflation peaked at a 41-year high of 11.1% in October. Now, while the drop is welcome, inflation is still running at levels last seen in the early 1980s. UK prices are also rising faster than in other major industrialized nations. Inflation slowed to 6.3% last month in Canada, 6.5% in the US, and 9.2% in the 20 countries that use the euro. A Japanese court has acquitted 3 former utility executives in the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The 3 were found not guilty of negligence over the 2011 nuclear power plant disaster and subsequent deaths of more than 40 elderly residents during a forced evacuation. The Tokyo High Court ruling upheld a 2019 lower court decision that also acquitted the 3 former top officials of Tokyo Electric Power Company Holdings, saying that a tsunami of the size that hit the plant was unforeseeable and the executives could not be held negligent. In other legal news, Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa and her news company have been cleared of tax evasion charges. She has said the charges were among the legal cases used by former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte to muzzle critical reporting. Ms. Ressa commented after the ruling that today, facts win, truth wins, justice wins. She won the Nobel Peace Prize with Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov in 2021 for defying government efforts to shut their news organizations. Ms. Ressa and Rappler face 3 more legal cases. To the latest now in tech-related layoffs, where Microsoft is cutting 10,000 workers, which equals roughly 5% of its global workforce. In a regulatory filing today, the company said it had just notified employees of the layoffs, some of which were set to start immediately. Microsoft said the layoffs were in response to macroeconomic conditions and changing customer priorities. It also intends to make changes to its hardware portfolio and consolidate its leased office locations in an effort to save around $1.2 billion. New photographs of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of 1943 have been unveiled in Poland. Warsaw's Jewish History Museum presented a group of photos taken in secret inside the ghetto by a Polish firefighter, as the Nazi Germans brutally crushed the uprising that happened 80 years ago. Some of the photos had never been seen before and were recently discovered in a family collection. While ending the newscast back at home, where the Canadian Screen Awards will feature some A-list celebrities this year. Deadpool actor Ryan Reynolds has RSVP'd for the event and says he is excited to be able to be there in person to accept a humanitarian award. He's among special honorees, including Marvel's Shang-Chi star Simu Liu, who is getting the Radius Award for Global Success, and SCTV and Schitt's Creek star Catherine O'Hara, who's getting an Icon Award for exceptional and ongoing contributions to the industry. I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. We're on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily, and have a great evening.